bold statement here. Bigfoot is the American dream. Bigfoot is what happens when Americans are grasping on to the closing lips of the American frontier. Bigfoot equals frontier thesis. Bigfoot is freedom. Bigfoot is America. Bigfoot represents American national identity. DBQ of a lifetime. You're not even ready for this. I'm gonna blow your minds with this video essay. Oh my god. What historical components led to the increased belief in non-religious paranormal phenomenon and cryptids during the later half of the 20th century? Good question. I have an answer. The closing of the American frontier, increased national stress caused by global conflict, and the decrease in religious belief led to increased belief in cryptids and non-religious paranormal phenomenon among the American population during the second half of the 20th century. I'm Katie Curry. This is, in fact, a history project. But I'm weird, so I wanted to do this anyway. And I'm going to explain to you why while you watch me make this here Bigfoot mask. Oh, it's so hot. Oh my god. So, for starters, the frontier and the ability to expand has been a cornerstone of American identity dating back to colonial times. A uniting factor for American colonists against the British was the ban on westward expansion following the 7 Years' War. American colonists who had beat back the French during the French-Indian War believed they had a right to expand into the West, which in turn started to represent the idea of freedom from colonial British rule. Famous rebellions, such as Bacon's Rebellions, also established appropriation of land from Native Americans as an important aspect of the frontier ideal. Succeeding the American Revolution, the establishment of the American Constitution gave birth to a second American frontier. With the Louisiana Purchase, which obviously grew the size of the USA, and then the end of the War of 1812, where the British surrendered the final land of the Northwest to the United States, which established this remaining land as a symbol of the preserved freedom of Americans in the eyes of the people. To quote Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune's famous Go West letter to R.L. Sanderson, quote, "This is the pivot wherein all must turn. I believe that each of us who has his place to make should go where men are wanted, and where employment is not bestowed as alms. Of course, I say to all who are in want of work, go west." End quote. The frontier is summarized similarly well in a quote from a traveler in 1816 who said, quote, "The people who partake of youth, enterprise, and hardihood are looking more and more to the west." End quote. The West was the vision of American future and the ability to continually progress. Expanding west represented a freedom and the need for hard work, which grants success, and through Manifest Destiny also established many American goals and philosophies. These ideals were exemplified by the gold rush of 1848, which promised ideals of financial gain, traditional work, escape from urbanized society, and policies designed to remove indigenous Americans from the land. The tension stemming from the theft of land from Native Americans was a notable landmark of this time period through the Indian Wars and the relationship between the frontier and indigenous people. This idea about American development and the frontier is summarized in Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, published in 1893, which states, quote, "The peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to changes involved in crossing a continent, in winning a wilderness, and in developing at each area of this progress out of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. American development has exhibited not merely advance along a single line, but a return to primitive conditions on a continually advancing frontier line, and a new development for that area. American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, This expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character. The true point of view in this history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it is the Great West." End quote. This thesis accredited American freedom, democracy, and spirit to the ability and ideas of continued expansion and renewal through westward expansion. American identity was widely regarded to be one with the ability for expansion, and served as a foundation for the nation's identity. But, in 1890, the U.S. Census made a statement which shook the foundations of America. The frontier was announced to be closing. Bum, bum, bum! Turner's thesis was actually published in response to this announcement, where he mournfully outlined the death of the frontier and how it would impact American society. And for the remaining decade, this statement was held true as unsettled lands started to disappear off of the map. The existence of the Continental Railroad accelerated this process by connecting the West with the remainder of the country and cementing the end of the physical frontier. But the spirit of the frontier wouldn't be dismantled so easily, and was continued in the form of none other than American imperialism. From 1890 to 1940, American imperialism was used as a way for the American empire established by James K. Polk to continue its expansion beyond the West Coast. Subsequently, the fall of the western frontier saw birth to the imperialistic rule of Hawaii and the Philippines. This period of American imperialism took the place of the American frontier's expansion of American territory, influence, and the appropriation of land from indigenous groups until imperialism's fall preceding World War II. Involvement from the United States in foreign affairs did not cease entirely because, of course it didn't, but following World War II, imperialism and the actual appropriation and conquest of land had substantially decreased, and also saw less engagement from the American public. The demands of the American frontier were no longer being fulfilled by imperialism, and discontentment in American society grew as a result. This lack of frontier degraded American spirit as Americans turned to alternate means to preserve the spirit of the frontier and in turn their national identity. Americans needed to develop a frontier that couldn't close, but that maintained the promise of financial gain, traditional work, escape from urbanized society, and of course, appropriation from indigenous Americans. The question of what would fill these requirements was answered in one rapidly spreading phenomenon: the belief in Bigfoot. The Bigfoot phenomenon had been gaining popularity throughout the 20th century, but really picked up popularity during the 1950s. Bigfoot is classified as a cryptid, meaning an animal that has been claimed to but never been proven to exist, such as the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, or the clowns of 2016. The legend of Bigfoot is based on the Sasquatch, which is a being that originates from certain cultural groups of indigenous Americans, those of whom most commonly believe that Sasquatches are non-physical creatures that present themselves as humanoid ape-like creatures, but have a more spiritual existence rather than being literal animals. However, through media and a healthy dose of appropriation from white Americans, the idea of the Sasquatch has morphed into the large, hairy, and bipedal animal which we identify today as Bigfoot. During the 1950s and 60s, Bigfoot's popularity skyrocketed as coverage in the media spread. Published in a 1958 newspaper showing footprints that were supposedly left by Bigfoot were most prevalent in rocketing Bigfoot into the attention of the media. However, it is not nearly as famous as the video taken by Roger Patterson in 1967 at Bluff Creek, California. This video is probably the most popular media connecting to the legend of Bigfoot, except for maybe Animal Planet's hit show Finding Bigfoot, or that one episode of iCarly. In 1968, a Bigfoot hoax dubbed the Minnesota Iceman, promoted by Frank Hansen, was a hairy male humanoid creature frozen in a block of ice, which was claimed to be the missing link between man and Neanderthals, and was used as definitive proof in the existence of Bigfoot-like creatures. The existence of such a creature was debunked by the Smithsonian Institution, which found it to be a quote-unquote carnival exhibit. However, this debunking did not end the readily increasing belief in Bigfoot. Due to the fact that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence either, Bigfoot was impossible to fully disprove, because although one sample could be debunked, the legend of Bigfoot could never be proven to be completely false without tearing down every forest in the continental United States. Bigfoot could only possibly be proven true, and the legend of Bigfoot could therefore never really die. In all, Bigfoot fulfilled all of the requirements of the American frontier. Bigfoot represented a frontier that couldn't close. The search for Bigfoot promised financial gain, traditional work, and an escape from urbanized society. Bigfoot even promised the frontier value of appropriation from indigenous Americans through its origins as the Sasquatch. As said by the Smithsonian magazine, quote, "Some people see these crypto-hominids as a symbol of pure freedom, living by instinct and foiling every effort to pin them down. To search for Bigfoot in the forest is to taste that freedom. On the trail, you become extra attuned to nature. The smell of scat, the sound of breaking branches, the curious impressions in the dirt. As long as there are wild places in America, Bigfoot remains a possibility that, to its most ardent proponents, cannot be disproved. The hunt for Bigfoot emulates an earlier mode of discovery, when new knowledge was not the product of advanced degrees and expensive machinery, but rather curiosity, bravery, patience, and survival. In the 19th century, the American landscape revealed its majesties to ordinary settlers, pushing westward into territories unmapped by Europeans. To track Bigfoot today is to channel that frontier spirit, as well as to appropriate Native American traditions. End quote. However, the closing of the frontier was not the sole reason for this increased belief in the paranormal. The closing of the frontier was widely responsible for motivating Americans to believe in and want to explore the unknown. However, evidence suggests that the increase in global tensions and national fear of unidentified enemies caused by the Cold War may have played a substantial role in the increased belief in the paranormal. Studies around human psychology link fear of the unknown to increased belief in the paranormal as a coping mechanism. An article published by the New York Times around the effects of the pandemic showed the belief in ghosts increased while people were quarantined and under high levels of stress. A national crisis such as a pandemic was able to fuel and create massive changes in the makeup of Americans who believe in ghosts. This phenomenon could be used to explain the rise in paranormal belief during the second half of the 20th century. With threats such as nuclear war with the Soviet Union, national paranoia caused by the Second Red Scare, civil rights movements, wars in Korea and Vietnam, the assassination of several political figures, Watergate, which destroyed people's faith in the government, as well as the later AIDS crisis, people had much to be afraid of during this time period. The threat of national calamity and the end of the world seemed to constantly be hanging over the heads of the American people during the Cold War due to nukes and stuff, so it's within reason to believe that these two phenomena could be interconnected. Fear of the unknown runs rampant in a rapidly expanding world, and fear of the unknown is statistically proven to cause an increased belief in the supernatural. An example of this phenomenon could be shown in the 1968 Bigfoot hoax, which followed the events of an incredibly turbulent year. With the recent assassinations of MLK and Robert F. Kennedy, as well as the ever-present threat of Vietnam and the Soviet Union, the public needed a distraction and an explanation for some of the uncertainty in the world. This hoax was done for this very purpose and brought the belief of Bigfoot into popularity even further. In the New York Times article, Emily Midorikawa, a biographer of Victorian-era women, drew a parallel to the increase in paranormal beliefs to the increased spirituality after other historical events as well. Quote, "There was certainly a real spike in people who sought the services of mediums, sought comfort in spiritualism about the time of the American Civil War." End quote. Her explanation stretches to beyond just these specific historical periods, however, as she said, quote, "When we think about all the things we're interacting with all the time, that might as well be a kind of magic for all the understanding we have of them." End quote. A research article published by the Journal of the Society for Psychiatrical Research in 2016 by Chris A. Rowe and Claire Bell found a connection between measures of state and trait anxiety correlated significantly with both perceived control and paranormal belief. Their findings supported the idea that paranormal belief is need-serving by giving feelings of order or meaning to rationalize the chaotic nature of the world. When the future seems uncertain to a group of people, anxiety and stress uses the belief in the paranormal to cope and alleviate some of that mental stress. This phenomenon also correlates with other paranormal understandings such as extraterrestrial life and UFOs. A reported UFO sighting in 1947 by pilot Kenneth Arnold garnered large coverage and caused the term flying saucer to be recognized by 90% of Americans 6 weeks after the article of the report was published. Fascination with the paranormal and unknown was fueled by the conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union, and only grew throughout the following century, correlating with increased Cold War tensions and the space race. UFO theories became intrinsically linked with the state and distrust of the U.S. government, and providing explanations for much of the uncertainty in the relationship between the USSR and USA. Finally, this trend in belief in the paranormal is also linked to the decreased belief in religious institutions, to which memberships have been decreasing readily since 1953. According to results from U.S. Gallup polls taken through 1948 to 2021 on the religious beliefs of Americans, number of Americans believing in mainstream or centralized religions have decreased. In 1953, 70% of Americans said they were Protestant, 23% said that they were Catholic, 4% were Jewish, 2% were another belief, and 1% were atheist, and also 1% had no answer. In comparison, in records taken from 2021, 35% were Protestant, 10% non-specific Christians, 22% Catholic, 2% Jewish, 1% Mormon, 6% other, 21% atheist, and 3% with no answer. The clear and discernible decrease in religious affiliation is also demonstrated in the new lows of church membership. According to the 2020 Gallup poll about church membership, 47% of Americans were members in a church, synagogue, or mosque, which is a new record low, especially compared to the 76% of Americans who were members of a religious institution in 1946. The question of whether or not paranormal beliefs function as an alternative to centralized religious groups was explored in a research study published by Springer in 1981, which found that there was a huge indication that those who are not affiliated with any mainstream religious ideology are more likely to believe in non-religious paranormal phenomenon. Obviously, though, belief in religious paranormal happenings like the devil or angels are more likely to be believed in by religious people. Evidence suggests that belief in non-religious paranormal phenomenon is in fact used as a substitute to religious forms of thinking. Non-religious people have a preference and a higher likelihood to believe in non-religious paranormal phenomenon like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, precognition, and more, while religious people had much less belief in the stated ideas. All this to say, decrease in religiosity from 1950s onward is partially responsible for the increased belief in non-religious paranormal phenomenon, which serve as an alternative to mainstream religious affiliations, and the decrease in religious belief correlates with the increased belief in non-religious paranormal phenomenon.
Overall, there are many factors that cause the increased belief in non-religious paranormal phenomenon during the second half of the 20th century. But, of those many factors, the closing of the American frontier, ways of coping with the uncertainty of the future due to global political tension, and a decreased affiliation with central religious institutions among the population all provided a culture and a society that was incredibly receptive to belief in non-religious paranormal phenomenon and cryptids. By far, though, the biggest factor in this development was undoubtedly the fact that Americans wanted and still want to believe in these phenomena because they provide a sense of security to the American population, whether it be in keeping the frontier and therefore the source of American national identity from closing, or being used to cope in the face of intense global conflict, and doing all of that in substitute for mainstream religious ideology as those belief systems decrease in popularity. And that, my friends, is the importance of the paranormal, and why Bigfoot is my American dream.
I love Bigfoot. Did you know I wanted to be Bigfoot when I was a kid? I thought I was going to grow up and be really, really hairy and then just move out into the woods and scare children. That was the dream. It could still happen. Bigfoot's my American dream. Bigfoot is my American